All right, everybody. Where we left things off was talking precisely about the cultural context for Said's Orientalism, um, the context being a post-colonial period um, in which the question of Western cultural imperialism and the cultural autonomy of the still underdeveloped countries that had become actually independent uh, was an ongoing one. And This text really was transformational in many ways because it started out, it essentially created the idea of post colonial theory. The idea that this world, which so often was talked of as the third world, right? Um, the first world being in the context of the Cold War, the liberal capitalist world, the wealthy part of the world. The second world being the communist part of the world, um, industrialized, not as wealthy, but still industrialized countries. And the third world, uh, that whole mass of the earth in which people were still in the process of developing industrial societies, the poorest part essentially of the planet, and the part that was just essentially winning its freedom in the context of this decolonization. And um, this world, the post colonial world, uh, in texts like Said's Orientalism, um, in a way found a voice finally to speak for itself after having been spoken for through the whole course of the modern period. Um, and To some extent, this is why this is a kind of a text, a kind of radical break, which then forced people to rethink, uh, not always without huge problems, which I haven't really talked about this too much, but my own work is actually focused on Said's Orientalism. It's based on a critique of Said's Orientalism. But here I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about Said's perspective, and I'm going to talk about where we left off our story, the story being um, how did European development, how did the story of development, which remember, since we've been talking about it from Kant onwards, the story of human development was supposed to be a universal story of humanity moving uh, towards uh, prosperity and peace. How did this idea of development nonetheless, in fact, become the means of dehumanization? Um, how did it lead to European imperialism on the pretext that these people did not have as yet the full humanity, or maybe never would, to be able actually to deal with their own affairs and determine their own fate actually in a modern, dynamic, changing world, right? Again, uh, this lecture is, like I said, a continuation of the idea of the dark side of development. And here, the idea is, again, with all of these third world countries, these underdeveloped areas of the world, how did European development become a means actually of the cultural dehumanization of these groups of people? Um, and this is what Said is doing when he talks about Orientalism, which we'll talk a little bit more about, as embodying essentially Western cultural imperialism. Now, the very thing that I've just said, this idea of development as having gone hand in hand with the dehumanization of the people who were not developed, right? Then it's this in itself, uh, at the time Said was writing, was essentially a kind of a problematic way of thinking about the very categories that he was using, because we think of development as going hand in hand with culture and with knowledge, right? This is exactly what Kant, for example, says. What makes development possible? Knowledge, uh, human progress, greater human understanding, greater human self understanding, which is one way of talking about what human culture would actually be. So, how could it be that culture and knowledge could actually become the means of dehumanization? How could culture and knowledge become something imperial in the sense of treating one group of people as less than human and so incapable of actually ruling themselves? This is what Said starts out when he talks about culture, the relationship between culture and imperialism, the relationship between modern European knowledge and imperialism. He's in a way breaking all kinds of categories which people thought could not possibly go hand in hand. If something was about development, if something was about culture, if something was about knowledge, then it couldn't be political and imperial in any dehumanizing kind of way, right? So by even posing this question, right, posing the question of cultural imperialism, of development as leading to dehumanization, this text was essentially breaking down some of the ways that Kant and the liberal way of thinking about progress and development and innovation have generally talked about the relationship. Remember, I said for Kant, in a way, politics is the problem because knowledge and culture are defined against politics. And uh, Said's argument is no. Um, European modern development became imperial. And that's really because from the very, very start, uh, it actually had a cultural imperialism at the heart of it, right? Um, so, this is what we want to understand. We want to understand what Said actually means by Orientalism as Western cultural imperialism. Um, it sounds horrible, but it's not actually clear what he's talking about. Why is it that the way that Westerners talk about non-Westerners, why was that dehumanizing? If they were trying to actually get to know their cultures and understand them, why does Said think that this is actually a way in which they came to control them and to dominate them and to colonize them? Um, uh, this is what we're going to try to work through relatively quickly in this lecture. Okay, cultural imperialism and Orientalism. What is the Orient? Who is the Oriental? When Said talks about the Orient and the Oriental, um, what he's trying to say is that this is not simply a geographical designation. Orient, the East, right? Easterners. Well, Easterners are simply not the Westerners, right? And there are these Eastern countries, these Oriental countries that have their own histories, their own cultures, their own trajectories, right? For Said, though, the very term Oriental, the very term the Orient, um, suggests that actually uh, these group of people are being thought about, are being represented, are being created in a certain way. How are they being created? How are they being represented? How are they being thought about? He argues that uh, they're being defined essentially through a Western perspective. So that when he talks about Orientalism, as he says at the beginning of the book, um, his focus is not on whether what Westerners said about these different countries or these different peoples, is it true or is it not true, right? And this is one way of thinking about it. This is Orientalism and Oriental scholarship, for example, which is what my work is on. And that was presumably the goal of we are studying these people and we want to understand their societies, and so you have to judge what we say based on are what we say uh, is what we were saying true or not, right? This is one way of thinking about Orientalism and Oriental scholarship. Said says this is not the best way of thinking about what Orientalism is or what the Orient actually is. Really, what Orientalism is, really, what the Orient is a way in which Westerners define themselves, right, by creating a story about the people who are not Western, the Orientals, right? Who are they? How are they fundamentally different from us? So we usually think about imperialism in economic terms, in political terms, or even in ideological terms. But remember, Arendt said imperialism was the beginning of the way in which identity and community started to be defined in exclusive terms. And this is what Said is very worried about. He's worried about imperialism fundamentally in cultural terms because he thinks it's the most fundamental level, actually. The way in which we define ourselves and then we see other people and other cultures, that is a more fundamental level of how we come then to interact with those people who we see as being different from us, who we see as being not us, that is a more fundamental question than, um, well, what are the economic prerogatives? What are the political prerogatives that lead us to do one thing or another thing? Because we will treat the people that we see as being the other, as being not us, in a fundamentally different way than we'll treat the people that we see as being one of us. So are these group of people part of us, the West, or the Orient? And so for the Oriental. And so for Said, this is a fundamental question of identity, right? Who's defined as being part of the West and who's defined as not being part of the West. And so for him, really, Orientalism at the end of the day says a lot more about Westerners than about the people that they try to describe in everything that they write about Orientals, right? And this is the key thing. He says throughout, I'm looking at all of these things that Westerners say about Orientals and have said throughout especially the modern history in which they clearly were superior in economic and scientific and technological terms. I'm going to look at everything that they say not as somehow being a reflection of the people that they're writing about, but as being a reflection of themselves, of how they define who they are, as opposed to the people who are not them, right? So that is who the Orient, that is what the Orient is. That is what the Oriental is. The Oriental is the other of the Western. Um, now, uh, what is the connection between this and imperialism, right? Um, Said's argument is that uh, this fact that the Orient and the Orientals were in a way created as Western representations of what is different from who they are, meant that from the very, very beginning, these representations were really the representation of the power imbalance between the West on the one hand and the non-Western Oriental world essentially on the other, right? So these representations are not simply innocent, scientific, scholarly, imaginative ways of thinking about another culture. For Said, these representations are uh, focused essentially on uh, the difference in power between the West on the one hand and the Orientals on the other. Why are we developed? Why do we have industrial societies? Um, why do we have this kind of cultural power of being able to mobilize all of our society, for example, to fight in the nation state? Um, and why is it that these people are not developed? What explains this? Why are we advanced and why are these people backward? So, uh, the whole representation for Said of the Orient by the West is focused actually on making sense of the difference in power between the West and the Orient, and it's made possible by this power difference. How? In the sense that because the West is developed, because it has all of this modern military, political, economic power, it also has the capacity to speak for these people around the world who do not have the modern capacity to do this essentially for themselves, right? So the fact that there is something Orientalist called Orientalism precisely suggests that there is a power imbalance in which the West can speak for the rest of the world, but they can't actually speak for themselves, much less uh, talk about the West and what the West is like. So, Westerners essentially get to play the role of humanity, talking in the name of humanity for the whole world, defining who everybody else in the world actually is, right? In a way that nobody else can do that for themselves. So, the Oriental and how the Orient and the Oriental are represented for Said again, are an expression fundamentally of Western power. They're an expression of the fact that um, the West is in a position to speak for the whole world in a way that nobody else actually is. The West is in a position to speak for all of humanity in a way that the rest of the world actually is not. And that other, those are the Orientals, right? And the whole point of representing them is to explain why is it that they can't speak for themselves? Why is it that they can't develop? Why is it that they are not us, right? To try to explain this, right? How uh, Europeans, through the discipline of Orientalism as a way of learning about all of these other cultures, or Orientalism as writing about, imagining all of these cultures, traveling there and writing about all of these people, right? What was the connection of this then precisely to empire? This way of uh, the power imbalance that allows one group of people to represent and talk for another, right? This is what at the heart of what Said means by cultural imperialism. So, how did this happen, right? And Said focuses on something he calls Oriental discourse, and he says that his focus is going to be on Islam and the Arabs and empire. Um, what does he mean by Oriental discourse? What he means by that is all of the web of representations by Westerners of the people they call Orientals and of the area of the world they call the Orient. Um, why is that important? Because again, he's saying it doesn't matter so much whether the representation is a scholarly one talking about what is the religion of these people like, what are their customs like, or whether the representation is a novel trying to imagine, um, oh, what are these Oriental women like? What are their lives in the harem, right? He wants to argue that all of these representations are part of actually the same kind of web in which Westerners get to essentially speak for other people, imagine, describe, represent them. And this is why he calls it a discourse, right? A discourse, meaning that it doesn't matter whether I'm trying to describe something factually or I'm thinking about it imaginatively. Both of those things actually are determined in fundamental ways in some of the predispositions and some of the assumptions that I already have about who the Orientals are, what the Orient can or cannot be. So it doesn't matter whether I'm trying to describe something factually or imagining it, because already the shape of the discourse, of its assumptions about who Orientals are, already determines everything that I can possibly say about them, right? And he says, I'm going to especially focus on Arabs and Islam. Um, because he wants to show precisely how this kind of power imbalance in the modern world allowed Orientals to try to speak for those that they saw as being other to themselves. Islam had always been the other in the medieval world, right, of the Christian European world. Um, it had always been the threatening enemy. That's how the other had been described. And Said wants to see, okay, what actually happens to this sense of the other and of animosity once we come into the modern world, into a developed, more powerful European world that now comes to talk about the Orient and the Orientals. Um, what happens to this sense of the Islamic other once we come into an increasingly modern, secular European world that continues to think of these other parts of the world that are not developed like it, that have not made the progress it sees itself as having made? Um, how is the other basically talked about in the context of the modern secular world, which is defined through this kind of Orientalist discourse? To ask that question for Said is the same thing as asking, how does Orientalist discourse objectify and dehumanize Arabs and Muslims? How does it explain that, well, these Muslims and Arabs are not us, they are not Western, because they don't have the capacity to make the progress that we have made. They don't have the capacity to advance themselves. They are still stuck in their religion. They're still stuck in backward ways of understanding women and the relationship of women with men in society. They're still stuck in despotic, authoritarian ways of understanding government. Um, uh, so, Said's question again is how does this web, this discourse of talking about the Orientals as not capable of actually making progress and advancing themselves, how is this done? How do Orientalists do this? And what is the result of it? The result of it is obviously a dehumanization of Arabs because you're basically saying they don't have the same human capacity to develop that we Westerners do. But how is this explained? How does Orientalist discourse actually do this? According to Said, Orientalist discourse does this by taking what was that anti-Islamic animus, right? Islam as the others. Remember, the Jews were the internal outsiders of European societies, they were not Christian. Muslims were the external outsiders of European societies. And Said argues that what Orientalism does and what Orientalists, when they study, for example, the world in presumably factual terms, do, is they take this anti-Islamic, like anti-Jewish hostility and animus, the sense of the Jewish religious other or the Muslim religious other, and they racialize it. They turn it into a racist distinction. How do they do this? Well, it's actually, interestingly, the same story, right? It's not only Jews that are Semites, Arabs are also Semites. Hebrew and Arabic come from the same language group. We already talked about this when we were talking about the Semitic Aryan distinction, when we were talking about anti Semitism targeting the Jews. But Said's argument is that the same process comes to be applied to explaining the external other, the Muslims, right? How is this done? Well, the Semitic Aryan distinction, the way it's explained by certain Orientalists in the 19th century, is that Semites, meaning obviously a linguistic group, people who speak Hebrew and Arabic. But in the 19th century, remember, these language groups, these philological distinctions were turned into racial distinctions. So if Jews and Arabs speak a related language, that means that they are racially part of the same group, just as if there are speakers of Indo-European languages from Sanskrit in India to German in Europe, that means they're part of the same racial Aryan group. Now, once you make this racial linguistic connection, then there was this idea that the Semites, the Jews and the Arabs, are somehow instinctively monotheistic, right? They believe in the one God. They are the religious people. Um, and what are the repercussions of thinking this? Well, the repercussion, think about Arabs come up with Islam, monotheism, Jews, the original monotheism. We talked about this already when we were talking about the book of Job. Well, the argument certain Orientalists make is um, if the Semites are somehow instinctively monotheistic, then what really differentiates them from the Aryans is that they don't have mythology, like the Greeks, for example, or all that mythology that we read when we started out the course by reading the Gita, right? The argument was Jews and Arabs are incapable, the Semites are incapable of actually having mythology. Well, it's almost like instinctively they're made to believe already in God and the one God. why would this be a bad thing, right? Monotheism is something that ultimately Christians also identify with, and so Europeans. But the argument was that mythology was actually the way of trying to explain the world, having a sense of the differences in the world, different gods standing for different forces essentially in nature and in the world and in the social world. And so the argument was uh, Aryans had this capacity for actually understanding nature and the world and the changes that happen in the world, so that they started out uh, thinking in mythological and then in pagan terms about the world. Um, but eventually, the more they made progress, the more their mythological explanations became scientific explanations about how change actually happens in the world. And yes, religiously, through Christianity, they also became monotheistic. But for Aryans, becoming monotheistic was actually an achievement, right? Whereas for the Jews and the Arabs, they're instinctively monotheistic. What are the repercussions of this? The idea is Aryans, Europeans, have the capacity to develop. They have the capacity to historically change and over time come to understand themselves. By contrast, the Semites, the Jews, and the Arabs are inherently monotheistic. They don't have the capacity to understand nature. They see everything as somehow being the will of the one God. And so, as a result, they don't have the capacity for development. They don't have the capacity for understanding themselves historically. They always see everything. Uh, this is Ernest Renan, the French Orientalist, who put this theory in the most stark terms. Um, and his argument was, it's the Jews and the Arabs basically only experience the desert. In the desert, everything is the same, and in the desert, they only see the one God. So they don't have the capacity to understand change. They don't have the capacity then to develop in any sense. Um, so here you see, this is the Oriental, is the Semite, racially incapable actually of historical change, incapable then actually of understanding themselves, right? The Oriental is always the same. It's only the Aryans who have the capacity to change, to develop, to historically understand themselves. Why does this lead ultimately to, why is this imperialist, this discourse, right? Uh, for Said, because it inherently means that what you're doing is objectifying and essentializing a group of people and saying these people are unchanging. They're always the same, right? So they're almost like an inert object, right? I can categorize them the way that I would almost categorize animals because I can describe them through their instincts, through their customs, they're always the same, right? They don't have the capacity to change and to understand themselves and to rethink and to revise themselves. So they can only really be understood in the historical scheme of things, in the story of humanity, by the way in which I, an Orientalist, I, a Westerner, actually represents and talks about them, right? Why is this imperialist? Well, it inherently means that if these people are not, remember, Orientalism for Said, the Western cultural imperialism, its focus was on trying to explain why can't these people advance like we do? Why are they different from us? Well, this gives you the answer, right? They are different from us because these people, culturally, racially, simply are incapable of actually developing and understanding themselves. So only we can understand them, if only we can understand them, if only we can allow them to make development, then that can only happen through us bringing them into the modern world, of allowing them to develop by actually going there and taking them over. So for Said, it's really this way of thinking about objectifying, dehumanizing groups of people by saying they are not like us, they can't actually change or understand themselves, right? That in a way necessitates imperialism. It necessitates basically Europeans going and taking over a part of the world to bring these people into the modern world. So the representations of the Oriental, which are based on the power difference between them, inherently try to maintain that power difference, right? By saying that it can't be any other way, right? So it's only the interests of Westerners, who presumably represent humanity, that can define what the interests of Orientals can or cannot be. It's only the Western gaze, it's only the Western understanding of the Orientals that can make sense of how these people could make progress or not make progress. They can't do it for themselves, right? And so you see, this is the sense in which, for Said, uh, Orientalist discourse is imperialist, and it's this kind of Western cultural imperialism that basically takes European development and uses it to dehumanize non Westerners, Orientals, to say why they are not capable actually of ever understanding or ruling themselves, that ultimately uh, allows for Westerners to understand, practice, justify imperial rule over these group of people. Uh, the Western imperial rule essentially is an extension of the cultural imperialism that defines Orientals as incapable uh, of being like Westerners, capable of understanding and changing themselves. Um, what does this have to do with the textual attitude that he starts out when he talks about the crisis of Orientalism in the second part of the reading that I gave you? Well, this is what the textual attitude suggests, that, you know, I can go, for example, and take an ancient text from India, or I can take some religious text, or the system of laws in classical Islam, for example. I can open those things and I can read them and I can say, oh, this is what these people are like. I don't need to do anything else because they're always the same, right? This is what it means to essentialize and objectify them. I'll give you an example. During the Iraq War, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain at the point when the United States and the so-called coalition of which Britain was a part invaded Iraq, um, Tony Blair talked about how he always had the Quran at his bedside and always read the Quran to make sure that he could actually understand Muslims and the Muslim world, right? Um, and if you think about it, that's somewhat, you would think, well, that doesn't seem necessarily wrong-headed. But for Said, that is precisely the idea of the textual of this textual attitude. I can go read the Quran, this text which it comes at the beginning of Islamic history and has been understood and interpreted in so many different ways over the course of Islamic history and has changed through all of those understandings in the same way that the Bible, for example, has in the Christian world. But the idea is that somehow I can go read that book and I can understand Muslims, right? Um, think about if somebody were to say the same thing about the Christian world. Well, if I want to understand America today, I will go and read the Bible. if I say that to you, that probably sounds just wrong-headed. It sounds ridiculous to say that you could somehow understand um, Christian America as a Christian country simply by going and reading the Bible. Um, but immediately here, you'll see people will say, well, I'm not sure. I don't think those two things are exactly the same thing because, well, you see a lot of Muslims actually see themselves in, they are much more religious. They identify with their religion much more than people in the West, for example, do, who live in secular societies. This is what makes the difference between a religious society versus a secular society. Um, but if you go to America, for example, when it comes to taking religion seriously, I remember there was a study a few years back that said almost something like 16% of Americans think that the apocalypse, right, the end of the world, in Christian terms, is going to happen within their own lifetime. That's a significant, large percentage of people. Evangelical Christians have massive power within the American political system um, and culturally in the society. Um, but again, somehow that's not counted in the same way as talking about Muslims. Muslims are somehow defined by the fact that they are Muslims in a way that Christians are not. Um, this is essentially what Said means by the textual attitude, by treating people as if you could read them out of a text that is hundreds of years old, as if they don't live in our world. They're still part of a world that has, you know, uh, that we have moved away from, but they are still essentially a part of. And this is why we can read a book about them, and that's hundreds of years old, and we can basically still understand fundamentally who they are. It's this textual attitude that exemplifies this kind of objectification and dehumanization as far as Said is concerned. Last point. Um, for Said, the consequence of all of this, of understanding that culture and knowledge can have these imperial dimensions, is to say that in some ways, every aspect of human life actually has power dynamics and power politics as a part of it. Um, Whenever I am thinking about a group of people who have an identity different from mine, there are questions of how I represent them, and there are power dynamics involved in how I represent them. So it's not just that, well, I'm an individual and I will try to be objective and not biased, as it's usually called. Um, and try to actually describe a group of people in the way that they really are. Said's argument is no. In all representations, there are questions of identity and questions of power that are involved that we can't so easily ever get rid of. There's no such thing in a sense of objective in that sense. There's a question of whose identity is involved, what are the power positions, what are the power dynamics involved. Um, and this has become a dominant way increasingly of talking about culture and cultural relations in the world. You know how Said starts the book by talking about himself as a Palestinian who lives in America. Um, and very often, people who are talking about other cultures, who are talking about what they think, they start out by talking about their identity because Said's argument is your identity fundamentally shapes the way that you can see another culture uh, in all the representations that are available to you of another culture, right? Um, this is a problematic idea this idea that identity is completely determinative of, or can be completely determinative of, what we can or cannot think. Um, but it's a way of thinking which, to some extent, makes sense in our world. When we live in a world with fake news, um, we think about, well, why is this representation, which scientists will tell you, well, this is false, or journalists will tell you that this is false, but why is it out there? Why is it that so many people believe in it? Well, we can tell stories about that in terms of identity and power relations. Um, and Said's point is, in some ways, that we're always stuck with those kinds of questions, right? Um, I'm going to stop there. And I can talk a little bit more for the people who are interested about some critical ways of thinking about Said. When we talk in class, if people have questions, or I will try to set up a Zoom meeting for everybody, but I will stop the discussion of Said for today. And remember, I will give you the chance to look at the video for tomorrow on Ulrich Beck. You can do that obviously when it's in session, or you can do it on your own. I would love it if you were actually there in session. It would make the humanities department look good. But that's essentially up to you whether you have the time and the willingness to do it. Okay, I'll see everybody on Wednesday, if not tomorrow.